podcast series that we've been working on and understanding our trauma and how it impacts us. Today we're going to do Know Thy Inner Child.
Yes.
Which follows up from our last podcast.
Yes.
In which we talked about Know Thy Agreements.
Yes.
Can you summarize what we kind of talked about last time?
Yeah, so we were kind of defining exactly what is an agreement, where does it come from, and then at the tail end we started digging in a little bit about how agreements are often made in childhood.
Yes.
And how those agreements that we made in childhood follow us out until we break them. A lot of times we're playing them out in childhood, or in our adulthood. So we thought it might be a good idea to dig into a little bit about how do we address the inner child who had originally come to make those agreements.
Yeah, and we talked about in that podcast the different roles that sometimes happen within the home,
Mm-hmm.
whether you're the scapegoat or the mascot or the enabler or the family hero. Mm-hmm. We talked about those. And we just thought each of those individuals take those traumatic experiences and really live out the ongoing messages that created that child, yes, even into their adulthood. I just had a conversation with a client last night and they said, yeah, I still think that even today. And I'm like, oh, so sad, mm-hmm, that we are still living out our childhood beliefs.
Yes.
And as you know, when we've been talking about trauma, we have talked about is how when traumatic experiences happen, our brain shifts to take in that event for our child brain, which doesn't have analytical thought.
No.
So when it happens in our childhood, our brain has to shift to be able to take in that painful experience and process it and protect ourselves, mm-hmm, because children don't have analytical skills.
No.
So what we want to talk about is how do we take care of that inner child, because we all have experiences that we can vividly remember.
Mm-hmm.
And I just have one that's when I was 3. I have vivid trauma memories from 3, maybe 2. And it's so interesting to see that just continues to be a thread that follows through our lives.
Absolutely.
So we're going to just talk today about how to take care of that younger part of ourselves.
Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about inner child work, when did we first experience that trauma? How old were we when we first experienced that original traumatic event? And a lot of times, like you were saying, our brain is trying to comprehend and find reason to it, but really what it does is it puts a timestamp on it. So we can oftentimes find ourselves reacting in a current event as we would have or wished we could have as a child when something similarly traumatic happened. So we experience a trigger in the present day and our inner child shows up.
Yeah.
So a lot of times the way that I describe it to clients is kind of like those Russian stacking dolls. We are a series of experiences. We're not just start and stop. We are a collection of experiences. So with that, I kind of use another analogy too of it's like your current age and your current self is driving a bus and all of your past experiences are passengers.
That's good.
So when you come up to a traumatic event currently or something reminds you of that, the wounded time-stamped version of yourself comes to the front of the bus and starts driving. So then, say for example, you had a message from when you were a kid, you have a memory of doing the dishes and your mom or dad comes in and says, what the heck are you doing? You're doing this so bad. Can't you even wash dishes right? What's wrong with you? Can't you see everything that you missed? That gets time-stamped, right? So say we were 6 years old when that happened. Does a 6-year-old say wow, mom or dad must be having a bad day? That was probably more about them than it was about me. No, we internalize that and say there's something wrong with me. I'm faulty, I'm wrong, I'm bad. So say for example then we're in our adulthood and our partner comes in and says, hey man, you missed a spot on this dish, we can, even though that wasn't, to attack us, we can go right back, and that 6-year-old comes to the front of the bus and, wants to fight and attack the way that, but because a 6-year-old in a grown adult's body has all the words and resources that an adult has, not a 6-year-old has. So
they're not good drivers.
No. So it's going to get messy, right? It's going to get really messy. So who originally coined the term inner child, just to give people a little bit more education on it? This is a theory that goes back to Carl Jung, and the way that he defined the inner child is inner child archetype is akin to an unconscious subpersonality that consists of when a person learned and experienced in the earliest years of their life. This inner child personality is subordinate to the conscious mind, yet influences the mind. This influence manifests negatively if the inner child is traumatized, wounded, or anxious. So again, a lot of times the inner child isn't at the forefront of the mind making all of the choices, but it's something that gets triggered, and when they are triggered, they show up to the forefront, driving the bus, making the choices, a lot of times kind of making a mess.
Yeah, and so sometimes even when we have clients, I'll say, how old do you feel when that's happening?
Yeah.
As a way to help them begin to identify.
Yes.
Well, what was going on at that phase of your life, so that we can begin to identify, okay, inner child is taking position here, and we need to be able to identify it and deal with the traumatic memory, so that we have better skills in taking care of when that memory surfaces again, when they come to the front of the bus. Yeah. So Jung was well beyond his time.
Oh my gosh, yeah, because this was like the late 18, early 1900s.
Yeah, and so it's so important and so I think sometimes people get a little like, woohoo, I'm a little scared.
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
feels weird. What are you talking about, when we introduce this idea? But if we can begin to say, this is how old you were when this trauma occurred. So therefore, when it gets triggered, when that little bruise gets triggered, you suddenly have this event where you are 6, and we need to deal with that and be okay with that.
Absolutely.
That's a big part of what we want to talk about, is how do we take care of it. So we need to understand it, because it will pop up, and it will pop up oftentimes when somebody else triggers it by saying something similar, but it could just pop up during a phase when your child is a certain age, when you're adult, when your parent is going through something and they are a certain age, triggering you, when they were 35 and now I'm 35, that comes up a lot. And so that's why we need to understand the origin of the trauma, which is why we're doing this podcast.
Yes.
And we need to be able to identify the messages and agreements that happened for that child. So let's kind of talk about, I think we've talked about that in our last podcast, but let's kind of review what kind of messages could someone operate in as a result of trauma.
I'm thinking, going back to what you were saying about the family roles of, say we were the scapegoat in our family. So the scapegoat is the one who gets blamed for everything all of the time. So maybe in early childhood we got messages of, we can't do anything right. There's something faulty with us. If something goes wrong or bad, it's my fault. If things are going too good, it's just a matter of time until I mess things up. So taking a lot of blame for anything that could go wrong, or assuming fault.
Yeah. And it could be just messages that is communicated by your parents' trauma.
Oh, yeah.
Like if your parents struggled with, I remember my mom saying, I can't do math, I'm a girl. And I'm like, what?
Okay.
But the point of that being, her trauma
Yes.
could have influenced me if I didn't identify that in my
Yes.
understanding of being able to do math.
Yeah. So I can't do math. I must not be able to do math either because I'm a girl too.
Right, exactly. So many different messages that we can have, and it's good to begin to identify them, so that we can learn to regulate. What does the 6-year-old need at that moment? And I often say to people, when your child self is most stirred up, the primary things you need are comfort, affirmation, and validation.
Absolutely.
There's not like that child doesn't need alone time. That child doesn't need to go do an adventure. They often just need a lot of comfort, validation, and affirmation. And sometimes we can't get other people to do that for us.
No, absolutely not. Sometimes we can, but a lot of times this is our own work that we need to do.
Right, exactly.
And I'm even thinking just those things that you said when we think about a traumatic event, what makes it traumatic for us versus somebody else who may have gone through it and may not have identified it as trauma. And it really, when I'm thinking about those 3 things that you listed, it's the lack of those things. If somebody's not there validating our experiences or comforting us and trying to like help us reason and understand these things and not find personal fault or blame with it, we need what our inner child was neglected at that point in time. What was my inner child denied in those moments? And a lot of times it is validation and comfort.
Yeah, and it's just so amazing. And guess what, everyone? You all have inner children.
Everybody does.
and we can learn to regulate that. And that's so. A lot of it is just even being able. I'm a spiritual person, so sometimes I will say, "God, I need comfort right now.
Yeah.
God, I need affirmation right now. God, I need validation right now." And I'm more aware of what I need, so then when someone tries to give it to me, I will take it in. That doesn't mean that I wasn't, that they weren't providing that before, but because I'm aware of the need of my child, I will be able to take it in.
It's interesting that you say that because depending on the messages, we may be continuing to. There's so much shame that can be associated with it just because there's a lot of shame that lives in trauma.
Yeah.
That the message and the agreement that we came into could say, you're not even deserving of those things. So how do we move into a place where we can be accepting of these comforts, whether it's from ourselves or from God or higher power or somebody else outside? How do we come to accept those things and take them in?
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of the therapeutic process. It's just having someone sit with you and validate your stories, your traumas. And sometimes they validate things well beyond you actually having awareness of. So therapy is just so important for naming the agreements, naming the traumas, and receiving validation and affirmation from another person is just so powerful in the process of getting to the place of receiving it.
Yes.
Because I have that safe person who does it for me, and I can then allow that to maybe spread out to other safe people. And guess the world is not all safe.
No.
There's a lot of unsafe people out there who are not able to give comfort, validation, and affirmation.
Yeah, I'm even thinking some of the agreements and how our inner child can seek out comfort if we seek out what feels familiar, right? So if it feels familiar to be invalidated and it feels familiar to be with an unsafe person, we can be reinforcing the trauma and reinforcing the agreements by continuing to go to unsafe people with the expectation that they're going to help us heal.
That's true. That is so true. And that's an ongoing problem for when the child's in charge.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
When the child is in charge of the bus, it will drive to places that are not going to be beneficial for the rest of the person.
Yes.
And that's because they learn to protect themselves in certain ways. And so just being able to identify, whoa, right now I'm very triggered. I need to comfort myself. I need to, do my breathing exercises, get my vagus nerve back in control of bringing peace to my entire body. But it's so important to do this work. It's so important to understand how it impacts all aspects of our life, our work world, our relationships with friendships, our relationships with our family. It's so important to understand those things.
Yeah, there's really not a designated time or place that our inner child would show up and kind of show up whenever and wherever. So having that understanding of this is my inner child showing up, this is my trigger, and being just so aware of when we are triggered so that we can offer that emotional regulation, because a lot of times when we're not aware of it, it can feel very out of control and powerless.
Yeah.
And a lot, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was agreeing with you.
When we're talking about trauma, so much of it is powerless feeling, and those coping skills that we did to try to regain power is a lot of times that wounded inner child trying to reestablish safety for themselves. And again, like you said, if the child is driving the bus, they may be taking you places that's not beneficial to the rest of the self.
Right. And I think what people will sit in our office saying, okay, tell me how to fix this. And I'm like, I'm not sure that I can completely fix this, but we can certainly learn coping mechanisms to deal with it. And tell me when it will get stirred up. It's not like you can drive your car and say, I'm going to have a car accident today.
Yeah, no.
You're not going to be able to do that, particularly if the child is driving.
Yeah.
You don't know when bad things are going to happen. You don't know when things are going to be triggered, except for with people we know always trigger us.
Yes.
Maybe it's family or individuals that we work with or whatever. And there we need to create good, strong boundaries to protect ourselves from these individuals, whatever that looks like. But we don't never, ever know when it's going to happen. I was thinking about that because, I had both of my births of my children were cesarean section. And it's very rare, but once in a while I'll sneeze or something and I still can feel that wound. And it's 20-some plus years later, right? So it's not like I can do anything to control what happened. But that same thing would be true with emotional things.
Absolutely. So even though I can't predict when it might be, oftentimes we can't predict. Sometimes we can, but again, we know either way, we can identify the trigger, we can identify how it made us feel, and we know what to do to address it and to offer some comfort and healing to it.
Absolutely. And so I think what we need to understand is how does that impact our relationships with our spouse, with our friends, to be able to identify, I'm sorry that I did that. I was triggered. That was a big childhood wound. You didn't know that. You just were an innocent party in the situation. To be able to own what is ours. The child doesn't want to do that. They want to blame the other person.
Yeah, absolutely.
As opposed to owning that vulnerable space, which is not a skill that children have. That's the adult that has to sometimes own it for the child. And not only is the adult part of self protecting that inner child by making good decisions on how much time we spend with this person, when, how, wherever, but also being that vulnerable person and owning it for the inner child. I just feel like we see that acting out if we just start watching, real life people on TV. you can Real Lives of Hollywood Wives or whatever. I don't watch any of those stories, but you can see the trigger. Ba-bam! Yes. You can watch it happen, and you see the shift in this person who's capable, and then suddenly not.
And a lot of times you can even, if you're really watching closely, you can even identify the trigger and name the wound of that person.
That's so true.
Oh, rejection is your wound. Jealousy is your wound. Feeling unworthy or unpicked or, second to last or, all of these things.
Yes, yes.
That
yes.
is your trigger, and now your inner child is here with all of your adult resources throwing a tantrum. And a lot of times that's what it looks like is our adult self can, when we're triggered, tantrum a little bit.
Ah, yes. We don't, and sometimes, so just being able to be okay with that is huge.
And not shame it, because again, the shame is gonna, one, pull us away from the accountability aspect of it, and we need to own it.
Right.
So we need to, we can't name it without owning it. So we have to do all of those things.
I think there was something that you said that I wanted to go back to, which was the idea that a huge part of monitoring, taking care of that inner child is having compassion for self. And extending compassion to self, which we talked about can sometimes happen as a result of therapy, and we see somebody else have compassion for somebody else, for ourselves, when in fact our parents or our teachers said, just buck it up, suck it down, move on, right? And so when we have somebody else saying, no, that's completely normal and that's okay, we can start to think outside of the box. Right? And so those roles that we play with our family creates a lot of boxes that we have to break to be able to receive that compassion, to take it in and to extend compassion to self.
I think that has a lot to do with answering some of those questions that, like you said, I can't tell you how many times I've heard it. Well, what do I do to fix it? How do I fix this? How does this go away? When will it get better? When will it stop?
Right.
And a lot of it does come down to compassion for self. And that can be really hard when we've been denied compassion and we've been denied being validated and care and comfort. And sometimes I find that the people who are the most gracious towards others are the most harsh on themselves. So
that's true. Well, they've learned to take care of other people.
Exactly. And sometimes we start there of like, do you have children? Would you talk to your child that way? If your 6-year-old was feeling sad and rejected, would you shame them and tell them to be quiet and tell them, that's not worth talking about? No, we would validate them. So how would you talk to a friend? How would you talk to somebody that you love? How would you talk to your own child, and offering yourself that same narrative? And
absolutely.
You're going to have to say it more than once probably. And it's not going to happen on the first try.
It's not going to happen on the first try. It's a long series of being able to take in and compassion for self and be okay with it. That's a healing process when we've grown up as the giver.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Takes a while. And there's a lot of great videos on YouTube. There's a lot of good books where they talk about reparenting yourself.
So, yes, that phrase can feel confusing as much as it is straightforward.
Explain.
So, reparenting, we kind of touched on it a little bit. So, when we're able to identify, okay, I'm triggered right now and I feel like I'm 6 years old. Maybe I have an implicit memory of it. Maybe maybe I just feel it in my body. Maybe I have the actual memory of what had happened coming forward. Let me just say, what does my 6-year-old self need to hear and feel that they were denied as a child? And it's that process of whatever our parent or caretaker had denied us in that moment, we offer that inner child. So we, in our adult healing and wisdom, offer comfort, and we parent the child that's coming forward.
Sure. And so it's that narrative where you're sitting there, you're upset with yourself, you're upset with how you acted, and you're like, no, wait a second. Everybody makes mistakes, which your parent may or may not have said to you growing up. It's okay, you made a mistake. And you're able to do the talk of affirmation and comfort and validation that you did not receive.
Even when we're taking it back to the caretakers of, you know what, I feel triggered because I set a boundary and I hurt somebody's feelings, and I remember when I was 10 and I hurt mom or dad's feelings by saying that I didn't want to do something, and now I feel responsible for this person's emotions. Maybe that narrative sounds like, hey, that wasn't fair for you to have to take care of your parents' emotions to begin with. Like, you have the right to set boundaries and feel comfortable. You don't always have to make yourself feel uncomfortable or make yourself feel small to make space for other people. You deserve the space too.
Right, and so, you know, when somebody, as therapists, we will like hear these phrases coming out of somebody's mouth and we're like, bing, 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 right? We're identifying, that's a really big statement.
Yes.
And when we're doing that, we're actually bringing some healing to that attachment wound that person didn't even know existed, which we talked about, Know Thy Attachment Style, one of our other previous podcasts.
Yes.
So in our resources, we're going to have some book recommendations that we might suggest in our notes section. Anything else that we want to say about healing the inner child?
Definitely, it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of time. And one thing, too, is I always like to remind people we're constantly being given opportunities to learn from ourselves. And it may take months or years worth of work to recognize when we're triggered in the moment. It may be a lot of reflection at first.
Right.
Of, whoa, I really flew off the handle there. What made me do that? What was going on? Oh, I was triggered. Now that I recognize that I was triggered, I can think about how old I was, and then I can go back and offer some repair to it.
Yeah, sometimes I think people don't recognize what was triggering them until they actually look. We have to look at the behavior first, which is that powerlessness, ambivalence, and contempt pack, which is a whole other podcast that we will eventually do, to be able to explain. Children didn't have the ability to figure out, ooh, that hurt.
Yeah.
They just did something to cope with the hurt.
Yeah.
And so lots of times those same ways that we dealt with hurtful things become adult behaviors that match our childhood behaviors.
Yeah.
And so following those behaviors is what we need to do.
I think that's a key aspect too of the compassion that we need to have for self, is our inner child didn't learn these coping skills out of any type of malicious intent to hurt anybody else. It was simply to keep self safe. And when they continue to follow us through our adulthood, it can be that they end up affecting our relationships in negative ways. So again, really just having that compassion for self of, hey, you know what? I'm doing this because that's what I had originally learned to keep me safe. And it's not that I'm a bad or mean or malicious, evil, wicked person. It's that I'm realizing now that I need to, these coping skills that I learned, these adaptive skills even, these survival skills are no longer benefiting me in my current self, so I need to learn something new, and I am learning something new.
And safe people will hear that and really validate. They appreciate the vulnerability of that honest disclosure of why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
And that itself will also be part of your healing as well. So take care of your inner child.
Yes.
And read up, look at our resources, because it's really an essential piece of breaking out of our not with the behavior problems, but our 6-year-old driving the bus. We're going to use that forever.
Yes.
The 6-year-old will no longer be allowed to drive the bus when we start figuring these things out. All right, have a great day.
Take care.